6 months, that's all it took. A brand new driveway, poured by a licensed contractor, cost thousands of dollars, and it was already splitting apart before the family who paid for it had even hosted their first backyard barbecue. No earthquake, no falling tree, no obvious accident, just quiet, creeping cracks spreading across the surface like something underneath was fighting its way out. If you're someone who's ever poured money into a home improvement project, only to watch it fall apart faster than it should, you need to see this one. Subscribe now, because every week we dig into the hidden construction mistakes that homeowners never see coming until it's too late. And this driveway disaster is one of the most common and most preventable failures happening across American neighborhoods right now. At first glance, everything about this driveway looked perfect. The concrete was smooth, freshly gray, with crisp edges and a clean slope toward the street. The homeowners had waited weeks for the crew to show up, paid a deposit, watched the trucks roll in, and felt that satisfying rush of finally checking a big project off the list. For the first few weeks, it was flawless. Neighbors complimented it. It photographed beautifully in the evening light. But here's where everything changed. A thin, almost invisible line appeared near the edge of the garage entrance. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't alarming. It looked like nothing more than a stress mark, the kind you might see on any surface that's settling in. Most homeowners never notice this stage at all, because it blends into the concrete's natural texture. But this hairline crack wasn't cosmetic. It was a warning sign, and underneath it, something far bigger was already happening. To understand why a driveway cracks this early, you have to think about what's actually underneath it, because nobody driving over a driveway ever thinks about what's 6, 12, or 18 inches below their tires. Concrete isn't just poured onto dirt and left to dry. Underneath a properly built driveway, there's supposed to be a carefully prepared base, usually crushed stone or gravel, compacted in layers using heavy machinery until it's dense and stable. This base acts like a mattress for the concrete, spreading weight evenly and letting water drain away instead of pooling underneath. When that base isn't compacted correctly, or when a crew skips layers to save time, the ground underneath stays soft in certain spots. It might look solid on the surface, but underneath there are pockets of loose material that haven't been packed down. And here's the problem. Concrete is incredibly strong when it's supported evenly, but incredibly weak the moment it isn't. If one section of ground shifts even slightly while the rest stays firm, the slab above it has no choice but to crack along that stress line. This hidden detail changes everything about how we should be watching new construction. A driveway that looks flawless on installation day can already be sitting on unstable ground, and there's no way to see that from the surface. The failure isn't happening in that moment. It's happening slowly, invisibly, sometimes over weeks or months, as the ground beneath finally settles into its true shape. Soil movement is one of the most underestimated forces in residential construction. Depending on where you live in the country, the ground beneath your home expands and contracts constantly. Clay-heavy soil, common across huge parts of the South and Midwest, swells dramatically when it absorbs water and shrinks just as dramatically when it dries out. Picture a sponge that's been soaked, then left in the sun for a week. That's essentially what's happening under your feet every time the seasons change. Now imagine pouring a rigid slab of concrete directly onto that kind of shifting ground without giving it a stable, well-compacted base to rest on. Every wet season, the soil pushes upward. Every dry season, it pulls away. The concrete, unable to bend or stretch, eventually gives in to the pressure. This is why so many driveways develop cracks not during a storm or a heat wave, but months later, quietly, after the seasonal cycle has had time to work its way through the ground. What happened next in this particular driveway surprised even experienced contractors who came out to inspect it. That single hairline crack near the garage didn't stay small. Within a matter of weeks, it had spread diagonally across nearly a third of the slab, branching out like a river system on a map. Rainwater began seeping into the crack, and once water gets inside concrete, the real trouble begins. Water is patient, and water is relentless. Once it finds its way into even the smallest crack, it doesn't just sit there. It seeps downward, following gravity, working its way beneath the slab and into the soil below. During colder months, that trapped water freezes, and when water freezes, it expands, pushing outward with tremendous force against the surrounding concrete. This freeze-thaw cycle, repeated over and over throughout a single winter, can turn a hairline crack into a jagged, uneven fracture large enough to trip over. This is the biggest mistake hardly anyone talks about when it comes to driveways, assuming that a small crack is purely a cosmetic issue. In reality, that crack is often an entry point for a much larger, invisible problem happening underground. Homeowners see a thin line and think it's ugly. What they don't see is water working its way beneath their driveway every time it rains, slowly eroding the compacted base, creating hollow pockets that make the slab even weaker over time. Now comes the part that costs homeowners the most money. As the base beneath the concrete continues to erode and shift, sections of the driveway begin sinking unevenly. What used to be a smooth, level surface starts developing slight dips and rises, almost unnoticeable at first, but enough to create standing puddles after rain. Those puddles then feed even more water into the cracks, accelerating the entire cycle. It becomes a slow-motion disaster, one that most people don't take seriously until a visible chunk of concrete has shifted or broken away completely. At this stage, some homeowners try to patch things themselves. They pick up a tube of concrete filler from a hardware store, squeeze it into the crack, smooth it over, and consider the problem solved. For a short time, it even looks solved. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Patching a surface crack does absolutely nothing to fix the unstable ground underneath it. It's the equivalent of putting a bandage over a wound that keeps reopening because the underlying injury was never actually treated. Within a season or two, a new crack forms right next to the old one because the real cause was never addressed. There was one critical mistake almost nobody noticed during the original installation of this driveway, and it's one of the most common shortcuts in the entire industry. When the original crew poured the concrete, they skipped installing steel reinforcement, either rebar or a welded wire mesh inside the slab. Reinforcement doesn't stop concrete from cracking altogether. Concrete is going to crack eventually. That's simply the nature of the material as it cures and as the ground beneath it shifts over time. What reinforcement does is hold those cracks together, keeping them tight and hairline instead of allowing them to spread, widen, and become genuine structural hazards. Without that steel skeleton inside the slab, cracks are free to grow unchecked. What should have remained a barely visible line becomes a fracture wide enough to catch a bike tire, a stroller wheel, or a homeowner's ankle. Professional contractors know this, which is why quality driveway installations almost always include reinforcement, spaced according to the size and thickness of the slab, even though it adds cost and time to the job. Cutting this step saves a contractor money up front, but it transfers that cost directly onto the homeowner's future repair bill. Another detail that separates a professional installation from a rushed one is something called control joints. If you've ever looked closely at a well-built driveway, sidewalk, or patio, you've probably noticed shallow grooves cut into the surface at regular intervals. Those aren't decorative. They're intentional weak points, engineered on purpose, so that when the concrete inevitably cracks from shrinkage and ground movement, it cracks along those clean, straight lines instead of randomly across the surface. Think of it like scoring a piece of chocolate before you snap it. You're not preventing the break, you're controlling exactly where it happens. When control joints are spaced correctly and cut at the right depth and at the right time after pouring, a driveway can crack invisibly along those lines for decades without ever looking damaged. When those joints are spaced too far apart, cut too shallow, or skipped entirely to save time, the concrete cracks wherever it wants, often in ugly, jagged patterns, right through the middle of the slab, where everyone can see it. In the case of this particular driveway, the joints had been cut, but they were spaced much farther apart than professional standards recommend, and far too shallow to actually guide the stress properly. It was a shortcut that looked fine on installation day, but revealed itself as a costly mistake within a single year. Most people assume that once concrete is poured and looks solid, the hard part is over. In reality, the days immediately following the pour are just as important as the pour itself. Concrete doesn't simply dry, it cures, a chemical process where water reacts with cement to form the crystalline structure that gives concrete its strength. This process takes weeks to fully complete, and the first few days are the most critical. If concrete cures too quickly, especially in hot, dry, or windy conditions, the surface can lose moisture faster than the chemical reaction can keep up with. This creates something called shrinkage cracking, tiny cracks that form almost immediately as the surface pulls tight like drying mud. Professional crews combat this by covering fresh concrete, misting it with water, or applying curing compounds that slow down moisture loss and let the chemical process finish properly. Skipping this step, especially on a hot summer pour day, is one of the fastest ways to guarantee a driveway starts cracking before it's even a month old. There's also the issue of how much water gets mixed into the concrete in the first place. It sounds harmless, even helpful, to add extra water to a concrete mix. Wetter concrete is easier to pour, easier to spread, and finishes faster, which means a crew can move on to the next job sooner. But every bit of extra water weakens the final strength of the slab. As that excess water evaporates out during curing, it leaves behind microscopic voids throughout the concrete, tiny pockets of empty space where solid material should be. A driveway poured with a watered-down mix might look identical to a properly mixed one on day one, but it will be significantly weaker, more porous, and far more prone to cracking and surface flaking within just a year or two. This is one of those invisible problems that no homeowner could ever spot just by looking at their new driveway. You can't see water content. You can't see the internal strength of cured concrete. You can only see the consequences months later when a driveway that should have lasted 25 years or more starts showing serious damage after 2. Drainage is another silent factor that determines whether a driveway thrives or fails. A driveway that slopes even slightly in the wrong direction, or one installed without proper grading around its edges, will collect water instead of shedding it. That water doesn't just sit harmlessly on the surface, it seeps into every seam, every joint, every microscopic crack, and it keeps doing this every single time it rains, for years. Combined with freeze-thaw cycles in colder climates, poor drainage can devastate even a well-poured slab over time. Trees add yet another layer most homeowners never consider. Roots from nearby trees can grow directly beneath a driveway, especially if the tree was planted too close to the edge. As those roots grow and thicken over years, they push upward against the concrete from below, creating pressure that no slab, no matter how well reinforced, can withstand forever. This is why you'll sometimes see driveways with strange, localized humps or lifted sections, long, straight lines of damage that trace almost exactly where a root system has spread beneath the surface. So what does it actually look like when a driveway is built the right way? The way that prevents all of this from happening in the first place. It starts with proper excavation, removing enough of the existing soil to make room for a real compacted base, not just a thin layer scattered on top of the dirt. That base gets built in layers, each one compacted with heavy equipment before the next layer goes on top, creating a dense, stable foundation that won't shift or settle unevenly. From there, steel reinforcement goes in, sized appropriately for the slab's thickness and expected load. Control joints get planned out in advance, spaced according to the size of the driveway, not just cut wherever seems convenient after the fact. The concrete itself gets mixed to the correct water-to-cement ratio, strong enough to resist the kind of stress a driveway will face for decades. And once it's poured, it gets properly cured, protected from rapid moisture loss, and given the time it actually needs to reach full strength before a single car ever parks on it. None of these steps are secret. None of them require exotic materials or expensive technology. They require time, expertise, and a contractor who isn't racing to finish the job as fast as possible to move on to the next one. The difference between a driveway that lasts 30 years and one that starts crumbling within its first year almost never comes down to the concrete itself. It comes down to every invisible decision made before that concrete ever touched the ground. For the homeowners in this story, the solution wasn't cheap. Fixing a driveway that was built on an unstable, poorly compacted base without reinforcement usually means removing the damaged sections entirely and starting over the right way, rather than simply patching the surface again and again. It's a painful lesson and an expensive one, but it's also one that thousands of homeowners across the country learn every single year, often without ever understanding exactly why it happened to them. If there's one thing worth remembering from all of this, it's that a driveway's true quality has almost nothing to do with how smooth and clean it looks on the day it's poured. Real quality is buried, quite literally, beneath the surface, in the compacted layers of stone, the steel reinforcement hidden inside the slab, the carefully placed control joints, and the patience to let concrete cure the way it's supposed to. The mistakes that cause a driveway to fail happen quietly, invisibly, long before anyone notices a single crack. Understanding this changes the way you look at every construction project around your own home. It's not about avoiding concrete or being afraid of new construction. It's about knowing which questions to ask, which shortcuts to watch for, and why patience during a build almost always pays off far more than speed. The homeowners who learn this lesson before pouring their driveway save thousands of dollars and years of frustration. The ones who learn it after usually learn it the hard way, one growing crack at a time. If this kind of hidden construction story fascinates you as much as it fascinates us, stick around, because there are dozens more investigations like this one waiting to be uncovered, from foundations that shifted before the paint even dried to roofs that failed years ahead of schedule. Come back next time, and let's dig into the next hidden disaster together.